You are listening to The Material Revolution, a podcast dedicated to building a better understanding of and relationship to textiles, fibers, and resources. I am your host, Catherine Susi, and I'm sitting down with artists, designers, educators, scientists, and creative thinkers from around the globe about their specialized knowledge and experience in working with fibers, processes, techniques, and technologies with the intention to create awareness, inspire knowledge, address responsible practices, encourage creativity, and to build a material community. So I welcome you to tune in and listen to those who are contributing towards change and a material revolution. Before we dive into today's interview and content, you can find us at www.thematerialrevolution.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at The Material Revolution. And to view some of our video interviews, hop on over to our YouTube channel. Hello and welcome back to The Material Revolution. Today's focus isn't so much on a specific fiber, although we do get into some specific fibers, but it's more about a discussion and an examination of a process that's known as upcycling or creative reuse. For this discussion, I sat down with Melissa Ferreira Schwager of Adhesif Clothing, and after 17 years of her studio practice being based in Vancouver, Canada, she relocated to Germany in early 2020. But before we get into my interview with Melissa and how she came to develop her brand and how upcycling as a creative practice and as a design philosophy, which continues to inform her curiosity for working with vintage and secondhand clothing. So what is it about upcycling that makes it so interesting? Well, I think first and foremost, it is a form of creative reuse that we as humans, we as a species, have been implementing since the beginning of time. There's that saying, necessity is the mother of invention, and I do believe that this saying is really at the heart, is the driving force of what is motivating artists, designers like Melissa and myself, as well as the industry as a whole. The rise of upcycling has been long overdue. My own personal experience began upcycling clothing in the 1980s as a result of visiting massive secondhand stores in Montreal, where there was still a significant amount of garment production. And so I would find seconds, high-end brand seconds, that might have been missing a button or just didn't meet quality control specifications. And this is what really taught me how to sew, because I really wanted to be fashionable, and given where I was living in Southern Ontario, it really wasn't a fashion mecca, we'll say, but there was still a taboo around secondhand clothing culture. And although my introduction to upcycling was actually using a form of pre-consumer waste, in that these seconds were cast-offs that were donated to the secondhand clothing industry. It wasn't until I was in high school in the early 90s that I began to take an interest in recycling and upcycling vintage clothing. There was a plethora of outlets in the hometown I grew up in, and if by chance my mother listens to this episode, I used to actually spend certain days of the week, I would skip some of my classes in high school and scour the vintage stores, the secondhand stores, and they all knew me there very well, and so they would put away everything aside in a specific location in the store so that I could come back at the end of the week and pay for all of my findings. And this became a weekly routine over a couple of years. And so my training in textiles actually began in the thrift store. And it was how I began to identify quality fabrics over others, weave structures, knit structures. I understood garment construction. That being said, this was prior to the boom of fast fashion. So what I was able to collect during this time period was quite significant. And so I really learned about the history of textiles from the early to, we'll say, mid-century, the forms and types of fabrics that were milled during this time period. And it really wasn't until I went into my formal studies into textiles, not necessarily my training in fashion design, which came before this, that this education continued. And this is not for me to discount what I did learn in my fashion design training, but I will say that there was a significant knowledge gap and expertise in how this information was presented and communicated. Now let's fast forward to 2021. I've seen significant movement and the adoption of creative use and reuse into the practices of not just independent designers, but also by artists in various disciplines, as well as in 2020 during the pandemic. We actually started seeing big fashion houses reinterpreting their own materials, whether they are left over from previous collections or are dead stock that they are just sitting on. Rather than incinerating a lot of these textiles and these garments, which unfortunately has been a common practice by some of these big brands, but you are now seeing a different type of upcycling, a different kind of consciousness, a different kind of consideration, and a different kind of creativity that is being explored. And this is extremely important because I believe that you cannot have a paradigm shift, you cannot have a collective movement and to create the necessary change that's needed now and in the future if we don't tackle the value systems that are associated with the cultivation and production of our textiles and clothing. But ultimately, it's easy to point fingers at what people should be doing right. But the one thing that we can all do, that we can all participate in, is through creative use and reuse of our textiles and clothing. And that is, in my opinion, one of the most sustainable solutions moving forward, especially since there is an astounding amount of post-consumer textiles and clothing that's expected to be in our environment over the next decade. And I will say the thing that really excites me is that you now have upcycling being practiced at all levels, from DIY culture to independent designers to big industry, which means that this is not just a form of creative use and reuse that is used by the individual or for small batch production. In fact, I was told in the 90s during my fashion design training that I couldn't do what I was set out to do. And, well, I proved them wrong. But the point I'm trying to make is that upcycling is completely scalable. There is such consumer interest in having one-of-a-kind and interesting pieces. This has been one of the biggest failures by big industry, thinking that everybody wants a cookie-cutter, same kind of textile or garment, when in fact, we crave creativity. We crave cultural expression, and our textiles or our clothing are indicative of this. And when you remove some of those parts from the whole, you basically are left with a vacant garment or textile. But before I transition into my interview with Melissa, I do want to say that upcycling and creative use and reuse is the catalyst for social change that we've been longing for. And although it's been with us all along, which is usually the case, isn't it? That the accessibility to a solution to a big problem was there all along. Now, this isn't the only method or approach that we should take in considering our materials and resources. But I do think that if we are to collectively take action and to have the ability to participate in a solution to this very, very big problem, then this is a great way to reimagine not only our textiles and materials, but to connect us with our innate creativity, which is so integral to how we can better connect with one another, but also allow for us to have the opportunity to build a better relationship with our materials. And now I want to introduce you to my guest, Melissa Ferreira Schwager of Adhesif Clothing. Melissa was originally born in Montreal, Canada, and relocated to Vancouver, but it was being in her mother's sewing studio, and her mother worked as a seamstress in a production line in a factory in Montreal. But it would be many years later, after Melissa was working as a vintage clothing buyer, that she began to create her own garments out of vintage textiles. Melissa not only considers herself a designer, but also a textile artist because of how she creates her own signature patchwork fabrics using a complete zero waste process. Her sense of detailing and use of vintage buttons, applique, hand stitching, and hand dyeing, which results in remarkable one-of-a-kind textiles and clothing. Since establishing her eclectic line in 2003, she continues to catch the eye of international media. Her styling has been featured in multiple fashion editorials. Melissa takes a thoughtful and resourceful approach to designing, and in our discussion, you will find that she is implementing a new direction, a new form of printing in her work that really speaks to the sustainable materials and methods that she incorporates in all of her collections. So I invite you now to settle in for the next hour, grab your favorite cup of tea, and allow for yourself to engage with one expert's deep understanding and relationship to vintage textiles and sustainable methods and processes.
Hello, my name is Melissa Ferreira Schwager, actually now, and I'm based out of Königstein im Taunus in Germany. I would consider myself a bit of a textile artist as well as a designer. And all of the garments and accessories I make are with a zero waste process, and they're upcycled fashion.
Hello and welcome, Melissa. It's really great to see you again after so many years.
So good to see you too, Catherine.
And just as a disclaimer, I think it's important for our audience to know that I think we first met, I believe it was like 2005 in Vancouver.
A while back. Yeah.
Because I was trying to think about that. And yeah, and not that,
I think
that kind of
you're
dates
right. Yes.
us a little bit. I mean, it's essential to know as far as, moving forward in our conversation that we both had our, design studios and design practices for me, it started 2003. Was it around the same time for you?
Same.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So, but we both have become recent transplants to Europe, even though I know Britain has, isn't a part of the European Union anymore. But the point is I relocated here in 2019, and we didn't know that was happening in either of each other's lives. And you came just right at the tail end, the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic hit.
Yeah, January 13th to be exact. Yeah.
Amazing. So we kind of both dodged a bullet a little bit with our move, because it's a big move, as you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a massive, the biggest move I've had yet. Yeah, so far. My whole life and my whole studio into one 10-foot shipping container, actually, and shipped everything overseas.
Amazing. I was back and forth, had my apartment here for quite some time before. I only recently just got a studio. So I did several flights over a 6-month time period to move some stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, the scenic route.
Well said. I like that. I like that. But I think it's important to start our discussion today because I want to get into a little bit about how you started and your journey over the last, I would say it's more closer to 18 years now, we'll say.
Yeah.
Now that it's 2021. I think it's important for our audience because you have a specific expertise around working with post-consumer waste and upcycling. And so I think for our audience, how did you come to working with this resource?
Yeah, actually, we were chatting a little bit before this, before the officialness started, and you had mentioned something about fate, and I really feel like my life has been guided down this path since childhood. Literally, I thought thrift stores as a child. I thought thrift stores were where you went to buy, to get the things you needed for your home. My mom was always a very resourceful person. So thrift stores, we got almost everything we needed for the home and whatnot. So I've always had a passion for vintage clothing. I still do. It's still one of my biggest it's the thing that really kind of gets me going every time I see a beautiful vintage piece. So I was in and out of vintage stores, in and out of thrift stores. Right out of high school, I worked for Starbucks for a few months. And in order to keep my sanity, I would go to a place you probably remember, Catherine, called True Value Vintage.
Oh,
And
yes.
when they had the downstairs location,
That's
on
right. Yep.
Robson, I used to go there on my lunch break. I normally wouldn't even eat. I would just spend my whole lunch break going through all the amazing vintage clothing, and then with my Starbucks apron on and everything. And then one day the manager came up to me. I guess he saw me there all the time, and he was like, "Hey kid, you want a job?" I was like, "Do I? Like get me out of this coffee slinging business." And he said, "Come back in a month and we'll chat." And I was like, okay, this is a weird arrangement, but I hope you still remember me in a month. And there I was on the day, a month later. You asked me to come back in a month. So what's the deal? And then they took me into their office and they said, "Do you want to be a vintage clothing buyer?" And I was like, "I have no idea what that is, but yes." And thus started sort of really, it was kind of that pinnacle moment in time. That was, where I learned everything I knew over years about older textiles and cuts from the 40s, cuts from the 50s and 60s. And that was my fashion school. I would take things apart, learn how to pattern draft from garments that were destroyed and deemed for the landfill. I would take them apart and learn how to pattern draft that way, and so forth and so on. So yeah, that's kind of what got me started. And I spent a heck of a lot of my time between the age of 18 to my mid 20s, late 20s, in and out of places called rag yards, which are, I guess, becoming more and more known. Like CBC did an amazing segment on the behind the scenes in rag yards several years ago. I was just saw it on a teleprompter while I was in a restaurant and was like, "This is amazing." So there's a lot more coverage starting to happen now about where essentially clothes go to die or get recirculated. So my job really was to go through these hundreds of thousands of pounds of discarded garments and textiles on a daily basis and try to look for sellable vintage items for places like True Value Vintage and other vintage shops in Vancouver as well.
That makes sense. I mean, that was your sort of initiation into to the world. What sparked your interest in developing a clothing line,
Mhm.
recycling and upcycling this material waste? Like what sparked that?
Truly, and still to this day, I think a massive part of it is just the fact that I was raised with such a resourceful mindset. Like, having to shop in and out of thrift stores. And my mother, a really brief history about my mother's side of the family. They grew up like quite poor in Portugal. My mother's from a small island called Madeira. She had 9 brothers and sisters, and the stories that I get from that side of the family just they really blow my mind in terms of not having very much, not having enough food, just not having enough, right? So she installated, and so did my grandmother and my family members, really installated the don't waste anything attitude ever, right? Like, don't waste that last bite. That has a use. And there was always like, a salvage, but it wasn't like that growing up. It wasn't like, I thought about it in terms of salvaging or repurposing. It was just a way of life. And that sort of transferred into pretty much everything now. It's like you can't take me through the streets when they're in Germany. They have every 2 months you're allowed to put your bigger items to be taken to the landfill or to be broken down furniture items, what have you. You can't take me through these places because I will come home with lamps and furniture and things that I want to refurbish and try to it makes me literally crazy because I can see the use in everything. So for me, a lot of it was while working as a vintage picker, I would see these beautiful fabrics like gabardine fabrics, if you know how beautiful the quality of these fabrics, woven fabrics and what have you from decades ago, compared to a lot of like the fast fashion new synthetic textiles and all this jazz being produced nowadays. Like, I would be like, you can't just throw this away, like you could do stuff with this, right? And I thought the fabric in this, and not just the quality, but the story. Like, I always thought to myself, like, if these clothes or if these textiles could speak, they're 50 years old, 60 years old, and they're still here to tell the tale. Like, there's literally stories woven into the fibers, and I can feel that. I can feel that history when I touch the fabrics with my fingertips, I can just feel the warmness of it. So anyways, I just thought, this needs to be preserved and this needs to be retold. This needs to be put into something new for people to cherish, for hopefully generations like they did, back in the day. It was not uncommon to buy your good Sunday coat and have it last for a generation or two if you took good care of it. So that was sort of my mentality, is like sort of the rebirth of stuff that's still great. In fact, in my opinion, superior. I just have such a love affair for these stories. I love stories. I grew up with stories when I was a kid, and I think everything has a story to tell, So yeah, again, it was just breathing new life into things to tell that story. And obviously there's a sustainable aspect behind it. So there's just such a wealth of good from these older textiles to give to the world still, on so many levels, really.
Oh, and I completely get that on so many levels because of the vast amounts of textiles and materials that you've had to encounter. Obviously, over time, you do need to narrow down the focus because there is an inherent sort of knowledge that you have to build around what you can do and what you can't do with
Right.
materials,
Yeah.
as you
Yeah.
know. So
Yeah.
what materials have you chosen to focus on and to be an interpreter of?
That's a great question. I would say right off the bat, wool. I just love wool. I love everything about it. I love the structure, the feeling, the how it can be manipulated into shapes and or not. Or I love that it's a protein fiber as well. I love the natural aspect of it. Yeah, I find it just feels so comfortable to work with, from the start. It's always just, it's the easiest thing for me to put in my hands and do something with. The opposite of that would be silk. I love silk.
But they're both protein fibers.
But one is so like water, and the way that there's a different sort of mentality and mastery to dealing with something that has a fluidity to it versus something that has like such structure. It just holds its shape, without having to do much. And silk, again, it's like water. Just so the two I love, but for completely different reasons. And silk, I would definitely, or anything like silk, has been more challenging, but something I'm planning to work a lot more with. I have quite a bit of vintage silk I've hoarded through the years. So that this is something I'm planning to do, to work with a lot more this season, with the world of eco printing, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually just set up my makeshift eco printing station this morning. So I'm
Fantastic.
really excited to get cracking with that.
Well, that sounds, yes, eco printing is there's a question I have a little bit later on in my sort of script here. It is such a, the experimental, the element of surprise that comes along with working with that
Mhm.
is a lot of fun, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But I just, just to kind of finish this part of the conversation, when it comes to, obviously, given that you in your transition to Europe in the last year, I know that you're not producing as much as you used to when you were producing out of Vancouver. And so are you in this sort of space of reflection? Are you sort of still looking at how much you are producing as a result of this shift? Not, I'm not just saying like because of the pandemic. I mean,
Mhm.
in knowing your practice, what I guess the question I'm trying to ask you is, has this transition in your life and your career to Europe
Mhm.
changed the way that you think about how much you need to produce out of
Uh,
this material resource?
yeah, it's so interesting. When I was in Vancouver, I had a shop for 7 years on Main Street, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a lot of pressure behind, I think, having to have, selection and variety, especially with one of a kind clothing.
Yes.
It's such a time consuming process. So, for me, it was always like, how do I put something that's one of a kind into production mode? This was always like something I was always trying to figure out how to do, but with a low impact, like, because I've always tried to maintain as close as possible as I could to a zero waste process. And that's something that I feel like I've managed to really fine tune since moving to Europe. There isn't this pressure so much for me at this point, since establishing my brand, what it is that I create my aesthetic and what not to do that anymore, which I'm really grateful for, because it never really felt like it belonged in my process to feel this pressure to be, it was like I felt like a round peg in a square hole, where I was like, well, everyone else in the that's what you do in the fashion industry. It's about more, more, more. It's about quantity over quality. It's about bigger and go big or go home. And I was like, but that's so the opposite of what it is that my process is about, And so there was a little bit of what do you call
Conflict?
it? Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. An internal conflict, for sure, a spiritual conflict, and a conflict on all levels, really, because at some point, even if you are in this industry, you kind of feel like, you try to fit in, but then you get to a point where you're like, the world doesn't need more stuff. You get to a point where you're like, the last thing we need is more stuff. Like I think what people want, and I'm starting to see, I've really seen this shift happen, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, is I think people they're getting tired of that whole,
Keeping up with the Joneses.
yeah, stuff for stuff's sake. It's just like, I think people are at a point now where they do want something that has more content, more substance, better quality, longevity, and a story, something they can cherish. Thanks to Mary Kondo coming along with her whole, like, keep things that give you joy, that sparks joy. So for me, yeah, this process is really, I'm really grateful for feeling like I can fine tune kind of the process more, and just sort of like really hone in on things that I want to make, because I can look at it and can say I'm very proud of the way that this looks aesthetically, and the quality is also very important, that it has a long-term longevity to it, but also, yeah, not just making stuff for stuff's sake, like really enjoying the process. And I didn't buy a single piece of fabric all year last year, which was the first year in 17 years I haven't acquired anything new fabric wise, and which was kind of amazing to think about. I did a post recently on Instagram about the waste fabric that I was left with after 1 year's worth of producing garments, which I did still make, I'd say about 4 dozen new pieces last year, by hand and stuff. It was just, I'm just left with seams, and I'm still keeping all that with the intention of maybe, putting it into a workshop, and, I eventually want to do workshops for children as well, like upcycling workshops and stuff as well. So yeah, just all
Perfect.
about hoarding scraps at this point.
Well, it is a valuable resource. And, that's
Yeah.
one of the reasons why I not only just started this podcast, but part of what motivates what my understanding is that, textile waste and textiles in general, but textile waste, the valuable role that it serves as a creative material resource and as a opportunity to really learn and adopt the very necessary skill set of creative use and reuse, which is also known as upcycling. And so
Yeah.
this is a perfect point in our conversation. So in your own words, how would you best describe what creative reuse is or upcycling?
Okay. I'm not going to use my own words. I took notes. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Because,
Absolutely.
because to me, the term upcycling, when I first started this brand, it wasn't even really a term of phrase yet. People weren't even actually, I was calling my work recycled, like that, the fashion was made from recycled materials. I wasn't even saying reclaimed or anything yet. The coin phrase, happened sometime in like the late 90s or early 2000s or something. There's like this book called Cradle to Cradle. It was coin phrased, I think, by these authors from this book, Cradle to Cradle. And I think it was like, as the 2000s progressed, it started becoming a term. And, I used to have to explain to people what upcycling meant. And now everyone's super savvy, and it's totally amazing to see what a huge global movement it's become. Within that, I would say, again, I'm always thinking like, what does the term upcycling really mean to me? But I guess if you wanted to break it down, I'm going to give you my note definition of it. It's
Please do.
the process of transforming byproducts, waste materials, or unwanted products into new materials or products perceived to be of greater quality, such as artistic value or environmental value. So that would probably be the correct, the technical definition of upcycling, to give something that is perceived to have no value, greater value, really, if you want to break it down.
But how has it come to inform your creative process and how you choose to design?
That's a good question too. I don't know if when I go into creating pieces, I don't know that I go into them into making something with specifically with that in mind. Often, I just see a piece of fabric and I think what can be done to it? Like how do I transform this into something so that it's almost unrecognizable. That's the way like an empty canvas almost, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
often for me, fabric is, I've had a lot of people say, "Oh, your aesthetic, it reminds me of quilting," or "Your aesthetic reminds me of a painter's palette." And it is a little bit of both, with the patchworking process. It's like creating a composition. So for me, yeah, to see it's like it's not something from nothing, but it's similar to that, to see an empty canvas and to say, how can I completely transform this? Like, how do I give it my voice or my perspective, and then it's neat to see. I mean, in the beginning I was doing a lot more vintage reworks when I first started my brand.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of went away from that because of the whole, like, I need to mass produce mentality, and I started using vintage fabrics in place of new fabrics to create my own original designs from my own original patterns, which I still do. But now I've gone back to sort of what my first love was, which is reworking vintage clothing. And I always found it comical to sort of see what if people could figure out what that thing was before, like
Mm.
where this piece came from, or did this used to be a men's suit blazer? You'd have a lot of like 20 questions, which I thought was really cool because, got people thinking in that way, in that mindset to take something and turn it into something else and have it be useful or at least, interesting aesthetically to look at, or beautiful to look at.
Absolutely. And I think it's a form of like alchemy when the way that you're describing your process and the fact that, you have this ability to take this typically undervalued resource and you're able to employ these different forms of transformation to it so that it can be completely unrecognizable. There's times where you want to honor aspects of that textile or that garment and that those decisions that you make to sort of honor that story and that history, that depending on how
Mhm.
you want to what you want to
Mhm.
communicate. But do you not find the process of upcycling is an opportunity to allow for your concepts to come through the materials themselves as a result of you being an interpreter of these materials in a way, rather than just trying to communicate through it? Do you know what I mean?
I get these projects in my head, with certain things where I see, for me, it's like if I see an abundance of one kind of thing, then I'll be like, I'm going to make a series, So it's a sort of almost like a project based sort of approach, I guess, where right now I've come into something like, I don't even know, like 40 or 50 white and beige, cashmere cardigans and pullovers, like basic
Hmm.
sort of dead stock items. And who am I kidding? I don't know if I've ever worn beige in my life. This is just not, I'm the statement person. I like big and bold and contrast and beautiful. So I thought, oh God, something needs to be done with this beige landscape. So I decided I'm going to do a series of tie-dyed. And I even Googled tie-dyed sweaters. I didn't come up with much. I mean, tie-dye is a really big thing right now, and I've always loved it. But I Googled tie-dyed sweaters and I was like, why is nothing coming up? I was like, I need to change this. So yeah, I decided I'm going to do a series of tie-dyed, upcycled patchworky sweaters from this beige landscape of cashmere. So it's project based, I guess, for me. Like I see enough of something and I think, I can do something that's tangible. I want to make a series where people can come and see not just one of something, but a series of it, and have an aha moment and be like, oh, that's neat. I feel like for me, it's an easier way to portray my idea, to have several of one kind of thing as opposed to a piece by piece
Hmm.
thing. I feel like it's I think a lot of it is because I'm so used to trying to have what I do make sense to mainstream mentality.
Hmm.
And it's not mainstream anymore. So I have to keep telling myself that, I can just have fun with it and do whatever I want. But I feel like I'm constantly trying to educate people about what it is, about what upcycling is. There's pros and cons to that. As a creative person, like I, had just mentioned, would be fun to just do something without there being any sound reasoning for it. And maybe I'll get there one day, but
Well, I was going to save this question for a little bit longer later in our conversation, but
yeah.
what do you feel is the biggest misconception or knowledge gap around upcycling?
Well, I don't know if this sounds too ground zero, but I honestly feel I guess this applies to almost everything in life. You'll have to forgive the way my mind works right now. I'm dealing with a 2-year-old a lot of the time, so I'm always trying to explain things like someone's never even heard of it, like it's an alien language. And I think that a lot of it is just you have to almost admit that the knowing that you don't know. I think that's how I approach everything in life, let alone the whole message of upcycling. And I think it's good to constantly ask questions, because there is so much really involved. There are so many layers involved in the process of not just upcycling but reusing. And I think the biggest gap is that, again, if you don't know, then you don't know. So I think the fact that there is so much curiosity about the whole process, I think, is the biggest bonus about it, really. So I think, even if I don't want to say greenwashing, but there is a ton of greenwashing going on out there. I think since I started to where it's become now, you go on to Instagram and you just put in hashtag upcycling, and it's an insane movement happening right now. There is just such an insane movement, and there isn't a night that before I go to bed every night where I look at some of these accounts, and a lot of them are just do-it-yourselfers and hobbyists and whatever, but it's happening, and that mentality is there, that curiosity is there. So I think as long as that's there, and there are people like us in your wonderful podcast now educating people about the material revolution, I think that the more resources there are for people to be curious and to question. It's just about always asking questions, the farther along we'll get with the whole thing. But the biggest gap, I think, really is that there are so many larger companies that are jumping on the bandwagon because they see that there's such a huge market for it. People are interested. They're really curious. They want to do it yourself. They want to repair. They want to use what they already have in their wardrobe and reinvent. And it's such a creative process. I mean, the possibilities creatively are really endless. Upcycling is like a medium, like anything, right? So it's just about taking what's already available and turning it into something of higher value or something else, transforming it into something else.
And in my belief, it's an extremely important skill set, because regardless of whether you're a professional, and for those people who want to empower themselves to repair, their existing clothing at home, that's
Mhm.
one part of the conversation. It is a significant, like the paradigm shift around creative use and upcycling is in my opinion, the best solution, sustainable solution moving forward, not just because it gives the consumers this level of knowledge and skill set and empowerment through their clothing and their materials. But then when I think about things moving forward, as far as experts such as yourself and industry people who are learning to develop the language and the skill set, because it requires a different type of creative thinking. And I hope you agree with me on this.
Yes. Yeah.
It does require, because it isn't a linear way of
No.
problem solving and design. They don't teach us in design, because you
Mm.
have to develop an intimate knowledge of the materials that you're working with, which is a huge knowledge gap in the design system. And people
Mm.
may disagree with me on that, but there's a lot of people that do. But there is a significant lack of understanding of materials that's taught in
Mm.
the fashion design
Mhm.
education system
Mm.
to allow for students to be empowered or feel confident about what materials to pick for what design product that they're trying to develop. But what I'm trying to narrow in on is that it's a very necessary skill set at both the
Mhm.
all levels of industry, and it can all be very different. And that's the beautiful thing. Like what
Mhm.
you've done and what other people are doing, it's all going to be very different, because you're bringing your experience and your knowledge of a specific material resource into the conversation,
Mhm.
and it's bound to inspire one another. And we're all meant to be in conversation with each other. We can't just exist in these individualistic design bubbles, or just these worlds that has us pinned against one another, versus having this wonderful, very fruitful, fulfilling conversation that just shows creative and cultural expression, which is, to me, is the essence of what fashion is. Ultimately, it is the first form of visual art that we see every day,
Yeah.
and it's an important part of our cultural production, but it's also a very challenging industry, and everyone has a very different perception of that. Understood. In your experience
Mhm.
over the years and working with waste textiles, has there been one particular material, a garment or a textile, that you can describe to your audience that changed your practice?
I'll have to go back to wool again. I guess that's why it's still my favorite to this day. And I do work with a lot of denim. There is a ton. There is so much denim out there. I guess in many ways, in my opinion, a very undervalued material. Everyone loves denim, but it's a complex material to work with. There, if we're talking about the real deal, you're talking about vintage denim and stuff. It's robust. It's so practical. It's functional. It's also like, hello, all you have to do is throw on a pair of Levi's jeans, old beaten up jeans, and you're the coolest kid on the block. You don't have to
Yes.
try much farther than that. You put on a white t-shirt, a pair of your grimiest beat up Levi's jeans, and a pair of Converse, and that's just iconically cool. It'll always be cool. In 50 years, it'll still be cool. But yeah, denim's a big one. Wool. So I've spent a lot of my time experimenting with these two materials just because of the plethora of material that there is out there. Your question is like how I fine tune my process with these materials. There's just been, okay, back to denim. Since I'm talking about denim, the thing I love about it, it takes me back to my old school punk kind of me, the me that's always inside of me, even though I'm going to be 40 in 2 months. Just telling you,
Hey, I
there's
turned
there's that
43 soon.
amazing. Wow, what is your skin regimen? You'll have to tell me, Catherine. We'll share notes later, okay?
Sounds
Uh,
good.
no, honestly, I think it's just not never acting your age, really, truly.
Yeah.
But so that punk in me, whenever I do see kids that are on the street hanging out with their mohawks and their grimy, beat up, hole filled, paint splattered denim, it really gets me. Like I just gets me right in the bottom of my heart, and I still have such a soft place for that look, for that iconic sort of, yeah, Sex Pistols, Ramones. It's just forever cool. It's iconically cool. So for me, I thought, you can't really go wrong. Just you put the jeans under a truck and let it get run over 40 or 50 times. That in itself is a process, and see what you come up with,
It's true.
with denim, right? Like you can't really go wrong with that fabric. So I think a lot of it's just been a lot of experimentation. I love to dye denim really, intense colors, and the more you add to it, the better it is. So yeah, I feel like, a big part of the upcycling process really is, about happy accidents. I think you just need to just try stuff, and that takes time. Sometimes people want the easy route, they want the easy answer. They don't want to go through the years of trying to figure something out and honing in on that. But there's something to be said for that journey and that process. And I think you get to a point where you can work with something with your eyes closed, just like
Yes. Yes. There's
you
a
just
form of
know.
tacit knowledge that develops as a result of having these embodied experiences over and over again of working with these materials.
Yeah, you feel it in your fingertips. My mother
Yes.
is a seamstress, and I learned how to sew from her. And she says, you feel it. I know, and people even laugh at me to this day if I go through a thrift store or whatever, and I just run my fingers through something. I know it's like you have eyes on the tips of your fingers. You already
Hmm.
know what something is just by the way it feels on your fingertips. And I think that's something you get. I don't know if that's something you're born with or if it's something that you develop over years and years of working or feeling different types of textiles, or maybe it's a bit of both. I don't know, but it's a really beautiful thing, to be able to hone in on that. That I guess it's a skill or a talent. I don't know, but you don't get that overnight. And I encourage people just to play, just have fun and learn through the process.
Yes. And here's the thing, and just listening to you, and I guess what I was trying to articulate earlier, the important, valuable thing around what's happening in and around, we'll say, the paradigm shift that's happening with upcycling right now is that the people that are dabbling, the ones that we want to dabble and to mend and repair their clothing, the thing is that they start developing a bigger understanding of actually what goes into bigger projects. So
Mhm.
the DIY education, that's really important. And this is something that I was observing, like you, at least in the last 10 years, I mean, between my studio practice and teaching, is that I started seeing all these textile departments and these schools closing. One of them being the textile arts department at Capilano. which is near and dear to my heart because that program changed my life. So I have
Wow.
to shout out to them. But
Yeah.
because he started seeing this, and I thought, hang on a second. This type of teaching needs to actually get back into the hands of the people because
Mm,
they are so disconnected and do not understand what goes into the process of making clothing.
mm.
And as hard as that may be for some listeners hearing this, because I don't want to see textile schools and departments, it's a really important knowledge and skill set.
Mhm.
But at the same time, because now we're seeing it coming through this movement of upcycling,
Mm,
it's allowing for these knowledge gaps to kind of start. It's slow, obviously,
mhm.
but the fact that these big companies are getting on board, and I do have my opinions about that too. It's more than just a trend. It's more than just a fad. It is unfortunate that there's still so much greenwashing, and we could actually do an entire podcast episode on that, which
Yeah.
maybe is not a bad idea. Actually, we should sit
Yeah.
there and break down all these different,
Yeah. Yeah.
forms of greenwashing that's happening. But I think that in order for this to be truly a sustainable solution, that all levels need to be participating. And I think this is a really interesting conversation, being able to share this with you, because these are things that I've been pontificating on for quite some time. And to
Mhm.
be able to have this conversation is really important, I think, especially at this point in time in
It's so
history.
important. It's so incredibly important. You actually said something for my last reply to your question, and it's something that keeps resonating with me. So I just want to mention it quickly. And I think what you're saying is of the utmost importance. I've been saying for years and years that upcycling is the way of the future. It was at some point just a way of life. And somewhere along the line, we got really boiled. We got really comfortable with convenience. And I think the idea of sewing a button back onto your shirt or mending, it got lost along the way. I mean, that used to just be the way it was. I had home ec class in high school, and home ec kind of died off. I don't even know if it is offered in most schools anymore, but so practical, so useful. Oh my God, like, yes, you should learn how to make a tiramisu. Why the heck not, like, sew a button on your shirt. Like, you might even just like impress your first date, and boom, avoid the whole catastrophe of online dating just by knowing how to, sew a button and make some tear frickin' misu. Seriously, like, now people, it's not weird anymore. I think we just came from this, we're just so privileged, we're just so freaking privileged in our society, that I think it bypassed a lot of people to think that way, to be like, oh yeah, a thread and a needle, I can just not donate my new shirt and put a freaking button back on. I mean, you have no idea how much stuff I've seen in these rag yards with brand new tags still on. And I'm like, why?
Hmm. Hmm.
Why? Just because it's literally just missing a button or has a small tear in the seam or what have you. And I thought, if people could just get into that was a huge topic for me last year. I actually don't think I've done as much repairing as I have in my life as I did in 2020. I repaired left, right, and center, not just for my daughter or myself or my husband, but for his friends and his family. I mean, now that they know I'm here with sewing machines, everyone's coming to me for everything. But I thought, that's okay. I'm glad that people are starting to think more about repair. It's such a huge part of the reduce, reuse, recycle thing. It should be the fourth R, and people are starting to do that. And I think that in itself is huge. And I think when people start to think more resourcefully, there will be inevitably an even greater shift happening, where they're like, okay, now that I know how to do that, how about I replace the sleeves with this fabric from my nana's old scarf? Or, yeah, why not do it? And I think it would be great for it to just become commonplace, like making a tiramisu or.
Well, I think a lot of it, what it comes down to, and a lot of what stunted the growth and progression in the fashion industry, is this fear of failure. And I
Yeah.
think what you
Yeah.
just said to me is that, which is important, is the element of play
Hmm.
and going, oh, I don't know if this is going to work. I'm going to take grandma's scarf and make new sleeves. And if it works, I mean, it's the whole process of creativity. And I think important thing that upcycling what it has to offer is this opportunity to fail, and you just learn from your mistakes, and it's okay. You're like, I
Yeah.
won't do that again. or
Yeah.
or it actually sparks new processes and solutions and
Mhm.
pathways,
Yeah.
that the immense creativity that and what it has to offer. And this is
Hmm.
why I think it's such an important conversation that we're having, because if people get in touch with their own inner creativity,
Hmm.
it's amazing what they're able to communicate through their own personal wardrobe and through their materials. And I just really think it's such an important knowledge that we all share, but it's just
Totally.
but
Yeah.
the fact that your work has the ability to motivate that in somebody in a way that it's like, okay, well, I'm inspired by Melissa's work. I want to try and do it. They know that they won't have the ability to necessarily properly execute because they don't have the time and the skill set
Yeah.
that you've acquired after more than 17 years of working this way.
Yeah.
But that's valuable. But so
Yeah.
is their curiosity and
That
allowing
process.
themselves to
Yeah.
to fail. And because we've all gone through the trial and error,
Hmm.
but you kind
Hmm.
of let go of
Hmm.
like, okay, well, that didn't work. But it again, like I said, it opens up these pathways that actually inspires new collections and a new set of knowledge around working with materials. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I initially set things up a few questions ago as a two-part question. And so now I'll get to the two-part question. Second half of the two-part question is,
Yeah.
what processes or concepts are you looking to further develop? I know you mentioned earlier about eco printing, but what
Yeah.
new directions are you taking?
I've always wanted to get really a lot more into surface design. That's something I've just dabbled with. I'm self-taught. Everything I know about pattern drafting and sewing and garment construction and design has just all been through a lot of let's just try this mentality. So, I've dabbled with surface design techniques, but now that I'm in a place in my life, both personally, professionally, creatively, I have the time now. I have the luxury of time, and it's almost baffling. It's like, what do I do with all this time now? So I thought, it's such a time consuming process to eco printing. Learning about the world of eco printing, it's just like absolutely fascinating. It's like alchemy and biology and art and science and photography and everything all wrapped into one. And I'm really excited to start experimenting with multiple processes, with layers of processes, tie dyeing and eco printing and silk screening and all of these design techniques I know, and then to implement them into the upcycling, the reuse of materials, like all of the different layers and all the different textures, and see what I come up with. And I can see the things in my head already, and I'm just excited to just get at it. It's a really rejuvenating time, I think, to be an artist in many ways. I think, with all this reflection, it's a little bit scary and kind of like, oh, now what do I do? But you can take that as an opportunity to just let your spirit play creatively, which all of us need. And I think in the creative process especially. But yeah, I mean, I have a selection, like for example, of 12 vintage wedding dresses that I want to do a crazy series from. So I think a lot of it's just my path at this point is going to be there's going to be a lot of experimentation, and I think a lot more play than I think I've ever had the opportunity to have. So it's exciting.
That's
I'm
great. And
excited.
and are you familiar with India Flint's work?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yeah,
So I just wanted to ask because yeah,
yes.
she's really done some amazing groundwork,
Yeah,
in and around
truly.
eco printing. So I just wanted to mention her work.
It's like a life's roadmap. It's like her life's roadmap displayed on textile. It's
Well said.
absolutely
Well said.
fascinating. It's fascinating. So yeah, excited.
So as we get closer and closer to finishing our conversation today, I just have a couple questions, and I think quickly, can you pinpoint a time when you were with a client that responded to your work in a way that you didn't expect?
Like on any level, like positive or
I
negative
mean,
or
no, let's stick to I mean, actually, a good way of framing it is even if it is positive or negative, whatever you want, direction you want to
mm, mm,
respond in,
yeah.
how did it have an impact on you? And was there a possible insight that you developed that impacted your practice in some way, or just your
Mm.
understanding of how powerful your work is or means to people?
Okay, there's kind of two very short experiences I can on opposite spectrums from each other. Being in Vancouver and establishing my brand there, and then being there for 17 years, I developed quite a following, a big roster of like repeat clients and stuff. Did I think approximately 250 shows, exhibitions, and art design shows and stuff like that. So, I mean, through that time, I've met tens of thousands of people, and I think, yeah, I've had so many different comments. I think the ones that resonated with me more were the individuals who were like, they're definitely minimalists, right? And like I said, I'm really into statement fashion, and I love big, bold, and beautiful. And I've
Mm-hmm.
had individuals who are on the opposite spectrum of that, who were, the sea of beige, like I was saying before. And we're like,
Yes, I know the type.
but I think it was amazing that these people would come to me and they would stand there in the aisle and look at my display and look at all the pieces, and with this look of bewilderment every time, the same type of minimalistic dresser. And they would be like, wow, and they would be like, I would never wear that, but but wow, but I can really appreciate it. And that, to me, I think, was sort of the ultimate compliment, like to have like someone who is obviously a very minimalistic dresser to still come to me and be like, this
Mm.
is just so interesting to look at it, and I can still really appreciate it. So there was that always, I think, in a weird offhand way, meant more to me than someone who was like Iris Apfel walking into like my booth with all the like ornate whatever and being like, oh darling, I just absolutely must have this. I always appreciated that there were people that would know themselves enough to know that it wasn't that
Mm.
aesthetic wasn't for them, but could still really see the work involved and the time involved, and what have you. And then I had a fellow at my first European exhibition last year in September. I was fortunate enough to jump in on at the last minute, come to me, and with the most genuine, most sincere look on his face, like I had known him my whole life, and said, I can really feel the amount of time that you put into these pieces. He's like, I
Mm.
can I can really feel the love that you spent in here, in this booth, and just sort of, and said thank you to me, and then walked away. And I just, like, yeah, I had a moment. It just meant so much.
That's huge.
Yeah, it resonated, and I still can't. I'll never forget him. I mean, out of all the people I've met, and just the sincerity, the work that I made had moved him enough to be able to come to me and verbalize that he felt that it gave him that feeling, was
Mm.
huge. I mean, there's no amount of money that you can, it's priceless, this type of feedback. There's no amount of money in the world that can give you that same acknowledgement, that same, yeah.
As a takeaway for our audience, as we get closer to the end here, what do you really want people to know about your work?
I don't know. I guess I just want them to walk away feeling inspired that, I guess, anything is possible, really. I think in life, it's whatever you want to have from something. So, I mean, it is such a time consuming process that for me, there's a deeper level, there's a deeper reasons to making. It's not just about functionality or practicality or aesthetic. There's a kind of fulfillment I get in knowing that, the fabrics that I use, even the smallest pieces, are being given a new life. And I think, in the end, the result is something aesthetically pleasing or something that keeps you warm. But I want people to look at these pieces that I create and think to themselves that you can do, with enough time and enough love, and an investment of time and love, and creative thought process, that you can really make anything from perceivingly nothing, that you can take one man's trash as another man's treasure, in other words, right? So
Mhm.
I want people to just have a shift in the way that they think, and to the point where it becomes second nature, that anything is possible. It just depends on what amount of time and love you want to invest in that process, or in that art form, or what have you. Yeah.
Mhm, and I think that is kind of just to tie back to something you said earlier about how your mother told you all that the knowledge was in the fingertips, right?
Mhm,
And so
mhm,
that to me really speaks to that process, just to kind of make that connection, because it is possible to learn to see with your fingers,
mhm. Yes, that's right.
right? So it's
Yes.
possible to kind of see things in new ways and be
Yeah.
open to new processes, because things have been in a little bit of a box for quite some time, right? And so I think you do have the ability, and what you have done over the years and what you will continue to do is shine a light on what those past possibilities are, not just for yourself, but just for future generations. So I congratulate you on just kind of
Oh,
continuing to persevere. I know it's not an
thank you.
easy when you take the path less traveled in so many ways, but you also follow your intuition. It
Mhm.
does bring such fulfillment. So I that deeply resonates with me for sure. So is there anyone in the industry that you want to give a shout out to that you think is doing meaningful work or innovative work in the industry that's contributing to a material revolution? Someone that inspires you or just, someone that you know?
You, Catherine.
Oh, well,
You.
that's you're too kind. Well, thank you.
No, but really, truly you. I mean, most of the people that I know that were such a huge part of my creative community there in Vancouver, there is actually like such an amazing creative community going on there, really, truly,
Yes.
honestly, very unique, very special group of people. I've traveled the world and I always feel like maybe it's just because I did spend such a huge amount of time there and did become such a huge part of that community, but there is some great stuff going on in Vancouver as well too. Erin Templeton is also
Mhm. The last 5 years that I was in Vancouver and had my studio, I had half the downstairs of a building in Chinatown, and it was
yes,
next to hers. So,
yeah,
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 yeah, I'm
yeah.
familiar. Yeah.
And Erin Templeton and I did have our stint picking vintage together
Oh,
out of
that's
rag
right. I
yards
knew
as
that. That's
well.
correct. Yeah.
Her knowledge of vintage, I always loved our chats together, and she
Cool.
has such a keen eye, and she also makes her line of sustainable leather
Mhm.
bags. And yeah, there's a list for sure, but definitely whenever I would think about sustainable makers, you were definitely at the top of that list. So Catherine, you.
Well, thank you. Making me blush. But I will say, just to kind of piggyback on, and it's an important thing, and this hasn't come up in any of the conversations I've had today, and it's really important. And I've said this internationally when I've given lectures or just speaking engagements, that there's something about Vancouver, the time frame, and what was sort of given birth to in the early 2000s.
Mm,
I mean, slow fashion was coined by Angela Murals, who was a food writer. Obviously,
mhm.
the slow food movement was already in its progression. But, a lot of people don't realize what's considered the eco fashion and any of those sustainable practices, the hub that was developed, the level of innovation, because Vancouver's, a city that's located on the periphery, the most western, it's not the most westerly point of Canada. When you think of a big city, I mean,
Mhm.
most westerly point is Tofino, I believe. Someone can correct me on that. But Vancouver, because it's the level of innovation and creativity that has existed there, it really has planted seeds that I've seen that has proliferated. I can think of architecture. I can think of there's a whole list of people I can that had to leave because it is unfortunately a place that is hard to sustain a career. But I do think that it is the birthplace of creativity in the sense that it allows for you to plant seeds and to develop really important work that you're meant to take elsewhere.
Mm,
And so the fact that you and I are both have left after many, many years, Vancouver's my home, my Canadian
mhm.
home. I'm very much at home here in London, but it's such an important place and an important part of history that hasn't gotten its acknowledgement for what it's contributed to the field of sustainable fashion, textiles. I mean, it's the birthplace of Greenpeace and so many other environmental movements that it's no question that I feel like it does not. I mean, it does need to be given the credit for what it's contributed because there was stuff happening in Vancouver in the early 2000s that wasn't even in the knowledge or even part of the culture what was going on in Brooklyn or San Francisco.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember taking my work to New York for the first time in 2005 and being told, like, we don't care if it's eco-friendly, environmentally friendly. Like, what is the bottom dollar? This is really cool what you're
Oh,
doing, but no one
yeah.
really gave a crap. So the
Oh,
the
that's so
knowledge
interesting.
that
Yeah.
was, I was already 2 years into my business at that point in my studio. Anyhow, it could go on and on and on about this, but I really wanted to ask that question. And I also think it's really important that, knowing what we know about Vancouver and what it's contributed to, it really does need to be recognized. It's a unique place to live and to be. And there's so many, so many, so many talented people there. But then a lot of them have had to leave. A
Yeah,
lot of
yeah,
us,
yeah.
a lot of us great ones, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a bit of an unsung hero, and I think, as is the case for the individuals who birthed their ideas and their creative processes and their passions. It is and you're so right about that, about people having to birth. I mean, it's like, just look around you on the West Coast, right? Like, there's, hello, a pod of killer whales swimming by, no big deal. It's just like, eagles, oh yeah, another eagle, oh yeah, whatever, oh, brown bear, it's like, yeah, it's like you're just surrounded by this absolute pristine natural beauty, and the
Mm,
natural resources are so abundant. I mean, it's just, how can you not birth beautiful things from an environment like that? And so I think, yes, you're right about that. It's like, maybe that environment births creative people who need to take that message elsewhere.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a really
Hmm.
great way of putting it, Catherine. Yeah.
I asked you to share a memorable textile or garment with me. And this is a really, I asked all my guests this to share something, and it was a exercise that I would utilize when I was teaching with students to kind of share something about themselves in a less vulnerable way. And so, what I am just curious to know, what is your memorable textile? What can you share with us today?
Okay, well, that was a really, really hard one for me because I have an insane collection of personal items through my journey of picking vintage. But the piece that somehow always just keeps itself known to me is this vintage blouse that I picked when I was 18. And one of the first pieces I picked as a vintage picker. It's red, my favorite color. It's got the cutest little ditzy floral print all over it. And it's just sort of the just it feels like a hug, when you put something on and it's just like it was like always meant for you. It just almost the closest thing to wearing nothing, which I also quite like oftentimes. Um, and I took it with me. So when I was working in a rag yard, the owner asked if I would go to India for him so that I could teach his workers how to decipher Western clothing, vintage pieces
Mm.
in particular. So I set up a program. I went to India for him, and it changed my life. I've done some really crazy things in my life, but that just holds true. When I think of my life's greatest adventure, I think it was that time. And I went by myself. I was a single female backpacking actually through India after I had set up this program. And yeah, I can't tell you how much I learned. I think that was just before I started Adhesif Clothing, actually. And I thought to myself, I was going to come back to Canada and sell all my worldly possessions and just live like a nomad for the rest of my life. And then I started Adhesif Clothing. So I went the complete opposite direction, but it's that country changes your life forever. The people I met, the experiences, the things I've seen, and the resourcefulness, was such a key factor in that experience as well too. And so that top was on my back almost every single day. I had very few possessions. I tried to travel with only a couple of clothing items, and that was the one that I washed every single day, dried within minutes because it was like 47 degrees when I was there. It was like the hottest temperature I've ever felt in my life. And I mended it many, many times lovingly by hand. There's little patches all over the place, and I continue to keep mending it. So it just brings back a lot of just such a huge time in my life of personal development and spiritual development and clarity, I think. So yeah, it's one of those things that I see and it still brings me back every time I see it. So yeah.
Wow, that's really great and unbelievably powerful story because it's something like, I mean, I can only imagine what your collection is like. So the fact that you chose that and that really speaks to, an element of our conversation that didn't come up because I do know about your travels in India and I think that it's a really important component to your actual story as a designer. And so I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Is
Oh,
there
it's been
any last words about
a
anything
pleasure.
upcoming that you're planning to I know it's really I mean, like, what are people doing right now? I mean, I'm still in lockdown here in London. So is there anything in 2021 that's upcoming? I know you briefly mentioned you want to teach workshops with children
Mhm,
eventually with
mhm,
upcycling. You're going to be doing some eco printing, but is
mhm.
there anything that people can look forward to? And I'm going to share, I should mention, obviously the photos of that memorable garment. I will have links available to your website and Instagram and social media
Thanks,
handles.
Kat.
So it's just important for me to let people know that, because some people will just be listening to this and some will be watching this. So just want to get a sense of what's going on. Anything you want to throw out there?
As many people feel kind of up in the air about making any major plans this year, I guess we'll have to just wait and see how everything unfolds and stay hopeful that the situation will get better, and it will eventually, but it's hard to still, again, make plans. But I do have one really, really amazing thing to share. I just found out a couple days ago that I have been accepted into that same exhibition I told you about that I was lucky enough to join in on at the last minute. It's called Unique Der Manufacturing Market. It's Manufacturing Market is all one word in German, and market is market without an E. So Markt.
Got it.
Manufacturing Market. It's going to be at a monastery. It's an old
Cool.
monastery. It's absolutely beautiful building. And it's set in a vineyard. So it's actually typically a place where people go to do wine tasting. They're known for
Dream
their
come true.
Yeah, they're known for their Riesling. So people walk around through the show with glasses of Riesling. It's quite a cool experience. So yeah, I think there's over 100 different designers, artisans, makers, and such a fantastic event. It's in the Hessen area of Germany, which is actually not too far from Frankfurt. I think it's about
I know you are. Yeah, I've flown into Frankfurt. Yeah, I've spent, I didn't get a chance to tell you earlier when we were talking before we started recording, but I spent quite a bit of time in Germany over the years. So
I think you mentioned that last time.
Yeah. So that's super cool.
So
It's
if
one of my
you're
favorite
around,
countries.
Catherine, you should hop on a plane and jet over to this event. It's on May 29th and 30th. So who knows?
I'm going to make a note of this. So
yeah, May 29th and 30th. And it's in the Rheingau area, Rheingau region. So very famous for, again, their Riesling. So if anything, just come drink some Riesling with me.
I may have to take you up on the invitation.
But yeah, so if all goes well, and if not, then they'll probably just reschedule, because that's what they did last year. It was supposed to be May last year, but they moved it to the end of September. So, but this string of events is put on by a company called Open Mind Management, and they actually have, I don't even know, probably at least 20 different events throughout the year, all for different types of artisan made work. They have a jewelry show and a fine arts show, and this show is called the Unique Manufacturing. So highlighting unique manufacturing by local makers, a lot of them from the region, although there were some people from France, and I don't even know, there could be people as far as Spain. I'm not quite sure. I didn't get to see the whole show. I was too busy trying to speak German to people in my booth.
Right.
Yeah. So that's my big news for the year, hopefully. Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed our conversation today. And I think moving forward, I want to continue having more conversations. And I do have some plans to do panel discussions and to do sort of these breakdown conversations in and around issues that come up within the field as a whole that I want to have deeper conversations about. And so I look forward to having you on again and continuing our conversation. So stay well in Germany.
Yes, you too. You take care and stay safe. And
yes, thank you.
This too shall pass, right?
Absolutely.
We'll be cheersing Riesling before you know it.
Ding.
Ding.
Great. Well, again, thank you. I'll talk.
You take good care. Yeah. Take good care. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode of The Material Revolution. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, comments, or perhaps you may want to suggest a topic, material innovation, or an expert that you would like to hear on an upcoming episode, please reach out to us via email at info@thematerialrevolution.com, or you can contact us through any of our social media channels. If you haven't done so already and have enjoyed this episode, please make sure you subscribe to the show via Apple Podcasts or from any platform that you're choosing to listen to this from. We would appreciate it if you could rate, review, and help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with friends. And if you would like to support this podcast further, consider visiting our Patreon page and make a pledge. You can do this by accessing the link that's located in the episode notes of this podcast, or you can visit our website or any of our social media channels where we will have that link made available. Well, that concludes our show for today. We hope that you left this episode feeling more curious about what can be done with textiles. Music for this podcast is provided by Interior Design, composed by Rob Mathrew. If you dig it and you want to hear more, please visit the link included in the show notes or visit our website for more information about his work. You can also find images from today's episode located on our website, www.thematerialrevolution.com, and other show highlights are available on our Instagram, Facebook page, and YouTube channel.